Hi everyone, good to see you. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Ruben, I'm the Vice President here at UJS, and I'm delighted to be joined by Esther and Sarah from Keshet UK. It's Pride Month, and we are so glad that us and Keshet can work together to support Jewish students, to support uh, LGBT plus Jews in the UK, and to make sure that their experiences are centered and that they're included within all of the work that we're doing. UJS have just published and worked on a cultural review where we've really tried to dig down on what are the barriers to inclusion, what are the problems that we really need to tackle. And it came up with a number of solutions and a number of recommendations that we're working on and delighted to partner with Keshet on actioning those recommendations and broader work that we do together. So thank you, Esther and Sarah. Thank you for being here. It's going to hand over to you guys, and thank you everyone for
Yeah,
watching.
thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Ruben. So, for all of those who may not know us, Keshet UK are a British Jewish education and training charity that works within the UK. We work across the board of the UK and across the entire board of the Jewish community, whether that is Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Reform, Orthodox, non-denominational, cross-communal, whatever that is. And we like to work with any organisation that a Jewish LGBT plus person and their family may walk into to make sure that everyone has the experience that they deserve to have. We do this because we have a vision of a world where no one is forced to choose between their LGBT plus identity and their Jewish identity. Now, here's what we're going to be covering with you today. We're going to start by looking at what is Pride Month? Where did it come from? How did it start? How did we get to where we are today? We're going to look at Jewish, LGBT plus British stories. Why have they been hidden? Why don't we know them? Why aren't they public? We're then going to be looking at some famous LGBT plus Jewish people and their stories. We're then going to talk a little bit more about the stories we don't know. And then we're going to have a summary and hopefully you will give us some feedback. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Sarah, who will tell you a little bit more about Pride Month.
Thank you so much, Esther. So, before Pride became what we know today, parades, celebration, visibility, chosen family, joy, it began as something more urgent. It began as a protest. And at the center of turning that moment into something lasting was a woman called Brenda Howard. Brenda Howard was a bisexual Jewish activist from New York, and she is often known as the mother of Pride. In 1969, as many of you will know, a series of protests against police raids on bars and restaurants where LGBT plus people would socialize became known as the Stonewall Riots or the Stonewall Uprising. A year later, to mark that anniversary, Brenda Howard helped organize what became the first Pride March in 1970. But what made her contribution so important was that she didn't just organize a single event. She helped to create the idea of Pride as something ongoing, not just one day, but sustained, a sustained visible expression of identity and community. She played a key role in establishing what we now know as Pride Month, expanding events beyond that one single moment into something collective and lasting. And like many figures in LGBT plus history, her story isn't always widely known, and her Jewish identity too is not always part of how her story is told. And that reminds us that even the movements that we celebrate today were built by people whose full identities are only partially remembered. Pride didn't just happen, it was deliberately created by people like Brenda Howard. And that too is part of hidden history. Now, during Pride Month, we often hear about stories of visibility and progress. But today, we're going to focus on something slightly different. We're going to talk about the stories that we don't hear, the hidden histories. Because when it comes to LGBT plus Jews in the UK, the question isn't just who was there, it's also who wasn't able to be seen. And that matters because it's history that shapes what feels possible today. Before we look at some individual people, we need to understand something important. We need to think about the fact that these histories did not disappear by accident. For much of the 20th century, being gay in the UK was illegal. The law wasn't changed until 1967. And even after that, social stigma remained strong for many decades afterwards. And religious communities, including Jewish communities, often had limited space for openly LGBT plus lives. That meant that many Jews stayed silent, that they lived double lives, that they left their Jewish communities, or they were simply never recorded in history. So when we talk about hidden histories, we're not just talking about forgotten figures, we're talking about lives that were never visible in the first place.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So, I'd now like to delve into the stories of some people you may or may not know, but that are prominent LGBT plus Jewish British people. Now, the first person I'd like to talk to you about is Rabbi Lionel Blue. Now, Lionel Blue did become visible eventually, but it was only after a really, really long period of silence. Now, born in 1930, Rabbi Lionel Blue became one of the most recognizable Jewish voices in Britain. He was known for BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day, and he was known as a warm, humorous, and deeply human presence. But for much of his life, he lived with a profound internal conflict. He was deeply committed to his Jewish faith, but he was also a gay man at a time when those two identities were widely seen as incompatible and that they could not meet. For years, he struggled privately, and he struggled with fear, with depression, and with the sense that he might have to choose between who he was and what he believed. And he's spoken openly about how painful that was, but he didn't come out publicly until later in life. And when he did, it wasn't actually just a personal moment, it was a real cultural one. Because suddenly, here was a rabbi, a national figure, a voice of wisdom, saying openly, "This is who I am." His story matters not because it's neat or simple, it's actually far from it. But it shows us two things. One, it shows us how costly silence can be, but it can also show us how powerful visibility can become. Rabbi Lionel Blue was one of the first members of clergy to come out in the UK at all, and that was a really big deal, and has affected many, many hundreds of lives since, even though he struggled and had some really difficult times earlier on. Now, the next person I want to talk about has a very different kind of story. Rabbi Eli Tikva. Now, while Rabbi Blue represents someone who came out much later in life, Rabbi Eli Tikva represents someone and something else entirely, change from within. Now, she became one of the first openly lesbian rabbis in the UK within Reform Judaism. But she didn't just exist as an openly LGBT plus rabbi. She reshaped the conversation. She wrote about gender and inclusion within Jewish liturgy. She challenged assumptions about identity within religious texts. And she helped create space and multiple spaces for future generations. Her work asks and begs us to ask a powerful question. What happens when you don't just fit into traditions, but begin to change and transform them? And yet, as someone so great, outside certain communities, her name is unheard of, which reminds us again that even when change is happening, and even when it may seem visible on some perspectives, it really isn't always visible. Now, there's someone else that I want to talk to you about. And actually, his story sits at a very different intersection. Now, this man is Jonathan Blake. Now, he was one of the very first people in the entire UK to be diagnosed HIV positive. He is also Jewish and openly gay. Now, in the 1980s and 90s, the AIDS crisis was not just a medical issue. Of course, it was a medical issue, but there was much, much more surrounding it. It was surrounded by a lot of fear, a lot of stigma, and a copious amount of silence. For LGBT plus communities at the time, it was devastating. No one stood up, no one said anything, no one tried to change it. And for someone like Jonathan Blake, there were loads of layers. The stigma of HIV, the stigma around sexuality, and having to navigate all of that with a cultural and religious background. Now, his activism helped bring massive awareness to the HIV and AIDS crisis within the UK. But here's what's striking. When we hear about the AIDS crisis and stories and people who went through it, we rarely hear about people's Jewish identity within those stories. That part often disappears, which is exactly what hidden history looks like. It's not necessarily absence, but partial visibility. This is someone who's very well known in the LGBT plus community, and not necessarily as a Jew, and not very well known in the Jewish community. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sarah to tell you about two more people.
Thank you, Esther. Those are three really powerful stories. I'm going to add two more. Let's look at something slightly different again. For many of you, Stephen Fry is a very familiar figure. He's an actor, a writer. He's the former host of QI. He's also openly gay. But something many people don't realise is that he has a Jewish heritage. His maternal grandparents were Jewish and they fled persecution from Europe. And yet that part of his identity is rarely central to how he's talked about. This is another type of hidden history, not because it was suppressed, but because it's not highlighted. It reminds us that identity isn't always fully visible. Sometimes parts of people's stories fade into the background. So with Stephen Fry, we see another kind of hidden history, not one shaped by complete silence, but rather by partial visibility. A story where part of someone's identity is widely recognized and another part quietly fades into the background. And that brings us to something important. Hidden histories aren't always about the distant past. Sometimes they exist in the present, in stories that are still unfolding. And that is where Jo Purvis comes in. Jo represents a very different kind of story from the figures we've looked at so far. She isn't a household name. She isn't someone whose story has been widely documented or recorded in books or media. And that's exactly why she belongs here. Because hidden histories are not just about people we've forgotten. They're also about people we haven't fully noticed yet. Jo represents a slightly younger contemporary generation LGBT plus Jews in the UK, a generation navigating identity in a world that's more open than before, but still not always simple. She comes from a generation who were asking, where do I fully belong? What does it mean to be LGBTQ plus and Jewish today? And what kind of community do I want to be a part of? Her story isn't about a single dramatic moment of change. It's about something quieter, but just as important. The work of building spaces where people can fully exist as themselves. And that work often happens in student spaces, in community conversations, in everyday decisions about inclusion. It doesn't always make the headlines, and it isn't always recorded, but it does shape what Jewish life looks like now and what it will look like in the future. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that some of the most important history is not something we look back on, it's something we're living through, which means that some of the stories that we don't know are not just in the past, they're happening right now. Esther, I'd like to pass over to you to talk now about some of the stories that we don't know.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So now we come to what I think is one of the most important parts of all of this. The people we can't name. The LGBT plus Jews in the UK who never came out, were never able to tell their stories, and they never saw a future where they could live openly as their full self. They're people who stayed in communities but hid parts of themselves. Alternatively, they left entirely, worrying that there was and will never be a space for them. They're people who lived their entire lives that history didn't record because it wasn't safe, because it wasn't possible, or simply because there was no language for it yet. And this is the reality. The hidden histories aren't just the ones we've rediscovered. They aren't just the ones we're learning about now. They're also the ones that have been lost. At the end of the day, the most powerful hidden histories aren't the ones we've forgotten, they're the ones we'll never know. And so I just want us to take a minute to think about these people. Think about people you may know whose histories and stories are hidden, whether that's past, present, or future. Because it's only because of people like them that we are here today, that this change has happened, this development has happened, that we can talk about it, but we may never know who they are. And that brings us very nicely to our summary. We've talked through a lot, but it all might seem very historical. And I want to ask you, and I want you to think about why this matters today. Now, it matters for lots of different reasons, but it matters because when we don't know these stories, we underestimate how much has changed and how far we've come. It also creates a space where we can underestimate how much it took to get here, the effort, the pain that went into it. Every visible LGBT plus Jewish life today, whether that is student life, communal life, anything in between, only exists because of people who stayed silent, people who struggled, and people who slowly but surely made change possible. And so this Pride Month, alongside all of the celebration, it's worth remembering that hidden histories aren't just about the past. They shape what feels possible and is possible in our present day. And they remind us that visibility is never something that we should take for granted. Now, we hope that sharing the 5 stories we've shared today will encourage you to think about other people's lives that you may never have known about before today, as well as the people whose stories we will never know, but are only here today because of them. Now, we'd absolutely love your feedback. Now, the form is completely anonymous, but please scan the QR code on the screen and give us some feedback. It should only take a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for listening to me and my colleague Sarah talk. I really hope that you've learned something today, and if not from this, or what to take forward and to the people you speak to.
Thanks so much for being with us. And Esther and I both wish everyone who's celebrating a very happy Pride.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Esther and Sarah. I want to echo your wishes to everyone of a very happy Pride. It's been really interesting being on this call, learning about those stories that I didn't know. So always really fascinating. As I started talking about at the start, inclusion is so core to UGS's values and UGS's approach. And the LGBT plus community is so central to the Jewish student community. So we're really proud to work together and to wish everyone a happy Pride Month. Thank you all.